Hello, beautiful people. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about liberating our theology. And I know for many of us, including myself for a long time, I never thought that theology was a very interesting or relevant topic. I think that's because it was always presented as something that was abstract and far removed from my daily life. Plus, it had been framed, quite frankly, as white, male, cerebral, and stagnant. Now, over time, I have come to find theology incredibly compelling and interesting because I think that all theology is essentially autobiography. It is a form of exegeting our lives. It is a way of taking our present moment, our present struggles, and trying to talk to God about them, asking God the questions that we need answers to. And I think that theology that we encounter from history is also that same thing, people asking questions of their present moment, but then we lose the cultural context and have these disembodied and decontextualized conclusions, and the tensions and their significance is lost on us, but then we're sort of told, no, these are like the most interesting aspects of theology, and you're like, no, irrelevant. And so I have been on a journey not only to liberate theology, but actually to reframe my understanding of what it even is. I think the other thing about theology is that we have accepted something that makes really no sense, which is, on the one hand, that God is all-knowing and all-powerful and creative and imaginative and outside of time. And at the same time, that everything there is to know about God can be summed up in these 12 bullet-pointed tenets on one piece of paper that you sign when you get baptized at 12. And that God will never expand beyond that. And that somehow those two realities are supposed to exist together at the same time. I think that we resist theology because it seems abstract, it seems stagnant. There's this kind of cognitive dissonance. And then I think also it's just been weaponized against us. I mean, if you are marginalized in any way, you have experienced theology being weaponized against you to silence you and dehumanize you. Literally ripping the book of Exodus out of the Bible, to justify keeping African people enslaved and to hide from them the liberative message of Scripture. The ways that churches and denominations ran the Indian boarding schools under the motto of kill the Indian, save the man. I mean, if you are a woman, if you are Black or Indigenous, a person of color, an immigrant, if you are poor, if you are queer, Scripture has been weaponized to basically say, God, you are slightly less in God's image inside this white supremacist hierarchy, and you are not to be taken seriously. So I have been on a personal journey to reclaim theology, or as Alice Walker calls it, God talk. Its journey is twofold because I've become more and more aware of how theology has been used to silence us. And it's not just to silence us out in the world, but it has also been used to silence our own ability to listen to our inner voice, our intuition, our strengths, to pay attention to the core of who we are. Let's just case study with women. Theology has told us that, well, if you take Christianity seriously, you believe that we are in total depravity, and you just believe that humans are completely sinful, and hence we shouldn't trust ourselves or our instinct and our intuition. I don't ascribe to total depravity. I think that we're sinners, but I think that God made us good. And you add to that misogyny, a misogynistic theology that tells us that women can't be trusted and that our inner voices are even more flawed and, dare we say, emotional, so that we shouldn't be listened to, nor should we even listen to ourselves. We've also been taught that the bodies that house us are, if they are female, are dirty, and that our desires are unclean. Queer people are told that some of the deepest things that you can know about yourself are untrue and should be resisted. Women of color, specifically Black women, are perpetually gaslit and told that your interpretation, that our interpretation of the world is inaccurate. All of this creates fragmentation. All of this moves us away from the reality that God made us in her image on purpose, with beauty and gifts to bring into this world. All of those theologies are really created by those who are in power to maintain power. So theology matters because theology produces life or it produces death. That's why I care about theology. I don't think it's abstract. I actually think it's painfully practical and has incredibly practical outcomes in this world. And yet, often we don't have the language to interrogate some of the core assumptions that have been given to us. I also want to take a couple of concepts that we often hear referenced, but may not always have had the chance to dig into. I want to talk about how Western worldview, white supremacy, and patriarchy shape and take captive theology. I also want to acknowledge that there's a lot of other lenses through which we could examine and deconstruct theology. I'm not doing a class analysis. I'm not doing a abilities analysis on it. There are other lenses, but I want to use these as a case study. So the first lens I want to talk about is the Western worldview. Now, for me, I came to understand the Western worldview more when I studied an indigenous worldview, which was a big part of my master's program. But for many of us, understanding a Western worldview is difficult because it is the air we breathe. It is assumptions that we accept about how the world works. Similarly, no one had to teach me settler colonialism. No one sat me down and said, this is a framework in which we are going to live. I grew up believing that I had a right to be on this land, to call it property, to believe that indigenous people were primarily historical. I didn't have to be taught it explicitly because it was an assumption of my worldview. And so similarly with the Western worldview, like similarly with white supremacy, white people don't need to be groomed into it. Nobody had to sit with that white woman in Central Park and explain to her the history of policing and how it's always been used as a weapon against Black people. She had absorbed that truth through the way all systems exist to benefit her and her existence, and is based on anti-Blackness. So the Western worldview is, again, assumptions we don't even know that we're accepting. So a few of them, one of them would be individualism as a way we move through the world. I mean, we're seeing some really profound examples of toxic individualism in the way that people were protesting with machine guns because their individual right to a haircut had been limited. But to me, individualism as an assumption is that the individual is the most important unit in society. And one of the ways I remember when I was dating my husband, one of the things we really realized was how different our parents' definition of success was. Because Asian parents, my Korean mom, she doesn't want to raise an independent, like self-individuated child. She wants to raise an obedient child. And his parents wanted to raise like a well-individuated, well-rounded child. And so it just helped understand that the individual unit is what is important in Western culture. You see that in our language as well, the way I, the individual pronoun, is capitalized, and versus like we or you or us is not capitalized, and how we don't have in our language you, the collective, y'all. And so when we read scriptures that are addressed by God to a group of people get read as by God to me. And huge swaths of scripture that are God addressing a city, a group of people, a whole country, a generation, gets collapsed into God addressing one person. So this piece of the Western worldview shapes the entire way that we exegete and read scripture. It then shapes the entire way that we define sin. Sin is something one person does, and it is something that was fixed on the cross. So individualism is a huge part of the Western worldview. The idea that land is a resource, that comes inside of hierarchy, is a huge part of the Western worldview. Everything gets ranked. Race is a way of ranking people, and then gender is a way, so patriarchy becomes the ranking of gender, and white supremacy becomes the ranking and categorizing of people by race, and similarly by class. Putting everything into a hierarchy and creating discrete boxes that everyone and everything must fit into is an expression of how the Western worldview approaches knowledge. Everything gets broken down into small, discrete bits and placed in a hierarchical relationship with each other. So our relationship with the land is that we are over and above it, and that it is our right to have an extractive relationship with it. In contrast with the indigenous worldview, where not just the land, but all of creation, we are in relationship with all of creation. Creation is our relative. And so we have a responsibility to our relatives. I heard such an interesting thing from my friend Lenore 3 Stars about how the way a people is taught to deal with the land will be reflected in how they treat women in their culture. So I think that is so interesting about it is a consuming, extractive, exploitative relationship that the Western worldview teaches people to have with the land and with women. Individualism, hierarchy, compartmentalized knowledge, in contrast with everything is in relationship with each other. Humans exist over and above versus in responsible co-creating relationship with. Learning and knowledge is abstracted versus integrated and embodied. So that's just a small snapshot into the Western worldview. So let's talk a little bit about patriarchy. At its core, I mean, patriarchy is simply about male hierarchy, men at the top of the hierarchy. But there's just, it's worth hashing out because internalized patriarchy and some of the assumptions of patriarchy have actually been some of the hardest ones for me to put language to. So, men make decisions in society and in the family. They also hold the vast majority of positions of power and authority. They are considered superior. In our culture, like in the United States, a cognitive dissonance that we are comfortable living with is that we say everybody is equal and then live in unbelievable disparity. So because of men's power in society, then men also want to categorize what defines manhood. This is, again, the overlap of Western worldview with patriarchy, because as someone who grew up in Korean culture, I experienced patriarchy within my Korean culture as well, but it has a slightly different expression. But essentially, patriarchy is concerned with defining what is masculine and manly. Often that includes control, strength, forcefulness, rational thinking, strong work ethic, competition as a basis for relationship in society. That has expressions in militarism. So it plays out differently in different cultures, but men defining what is male. Male-centeredness, what men do, their activities defines what's considered progress. And then very defined gender roles. So patriarchy really demands that men have certain roles and women have certain roles. And that has, obviously very toxic impact on women. You look in Christian spaces, and that's why sometimes in Christian spaces, you have such archaic expressions of what the role of women is. But I think it has as even more toxic implications for our queer family, because if the intersection of Western worldview and patriarchy is creating boxes, and this is very male and this is what is female, and sometimes a feminist pushback might be let's value both boxes as much. Queer theology and the queering of theology would say, do we even need the boxes? But when people don't live in a place that honors queer identity, then people who fall outside of the strict parameters of those boxes are so deeply dehumanized by the theology that is the very gendered theology that is expressed in very heteronormative spaces. And then the last category to talk about is white supremacy. So to me, again, at the core of white supremacy is some very basic values. Whites should have dominance over other races. White behavior, values, culture, beliefs, physical attributes, speaking patterns, interpretations of truth are normative and superior. And white people are good, innocent, smart, truthful, and to be protected by the systems and institutions of society. So, white supremacy values, white dominance, white norm systems and institutions, white innocence, are then expressed in things in white supremacy culture. And so that might be something like, in Christian spaces, the mission is always more urgent than relationships. More always sounds better. More conversions. Let's have more church sites. Let's have more church plants. Let's have more conversions. Let's hit more campuses. And you can't really say because because the framework agrees to more is always better. But do you see how more and more numbers and always that expansionist energy is the intersection of the Western worldview, a patriarchal, competitive approach to Christianity, and white supremacy. The people who will be leading the way into those movements are always white. So the written word and white communication styles are considered authoritative, hence why a certain version of theology has been considered the closest to truth. But it's absurd. Leadership is defined by white men. This is white supremacy culture. There is a hoarding of power. There is a sense of entitlement to comfort. Hence why white fragility gets an entire book. It's so deeply ingrained into people formed by whiteness that they should not be inconvenienced, uncomfortable, or forced to confront cognitive dissonance. So all of these things come together to shape and colonize our theology. Then I will just add that as someone who grew up in the Korean immigrant church, I also have another layer around growing up in Korean culture, which has its own expression of patriarchy, its own expression of hierarchy, which is deeply formed by Confucianism, filial piety, a duty motivation, and I, trying to follow Jesus, exist at the intersection of all those things. And I offer that to say that it is a complex web of things that are looking to reduce our theology into something that will dehumanize us. Now, what is so exciting and amazing, and what I'm so grateful for, is the work of many people of color, and particularly women of color, to liberate theology and to reclaim it from the intersection of all these oppressive frameworks. I saw this when I heard Richard Twist speak for the first time, where he talked about the work of Native American Christians to reclaim that you can be fully Native and follow the Jesus way. That the Western worldview had tried to bring this very, very colonial Christianity that said you can't practice your the traditions and cultural practices and ceremony and language of your tribe. And then there was this growing group of people who said, yeah, we absolutely can. This is who we are in Jesus. In 1969, James Cone wrote Black Theology, Black Power, which, fam, if you haven't read it, read it. That is hands down one of my favorite books. So James Cone writes Black Theology, Black Power, which is just a particular articulation of Black liberation theology. Now, that was not when Black liberation theology was born. Black liberation theology, and basically wherever Black people on this continent have existed, it has been a form of liberation theology. And it's been a long-standing Hush Harbors tradition, and there's been, to be Black on this continent is to resist white supremacy. And so, but James Cone gave a particular articulation and expression of it. Then the critique of that was, though, you know what? Yes, we are about liberation, but Black women were saying, but you are missing that sometimes there is a male bias to the theology. And so you are missing out on the reality that sometimes, even though liberation is our goal, we have to grapple with the reality that we stay in places of oppression. We need a theology. We as Black women need a theology that speaks to the reality that liberation is not always a possibility. And how do we grapple with God in that? And so what they did, Womanist God Talk, they had a conversation with God, taking their pressing questions and the struggles of their present reality and honoring the lived experience of their own lives and of their aunties and of their grandmothers. And instead of saying we have to reach towards some sort of esoteric, abstracted dude over here talking about his own life and how much Augustine struggled with being a total hoe, and I'm sure like his theology is going to speak to us, they looked in scripture and said, who will speak to our lived experience? And they found the story of Hagar. And I think that this is brilliant on a variety of levels, because it shows how much social location shapes how you theologize. Because how many of us have heard men preach on the story of Abraham, and Sarah and Hagar essentially exist as peripheral side characters, right? you know, Sarah's sort of like goofy, and like Hagar, who even talks about her like she's just like an awkward sex partner, servant lady. But Abraham is the one who is called. Abraham is the one who has the promises. Abraham is the father of the Hebrew people. And that is what gets talked about and emphasized. Well, then feminists, and particularly white women, when they got a hold of the scripture, they saw themselves in the story of Sarah. Right? And so they're like, let's make her a more fully well-rounded person. And they began to see her as a person with agency and choices that she was making within the limits that culture had put on her. But see, she's proximal to Abraham. And so in the way that many people critique white feminism, Sarah doesn't try to break down the system. She simply tries to manipulate the system to her advantage. And then there is Hagar. And Black women looked at Hagar and said, we see ourselves in her story. Because here is this woman taken from her own country who lives in the house of this privileged couple. And she does not have control over not only her life, but over her own body. And she is exploited in a variety of ways. And then she escapes. And then she is sent back. And that plight of, yes, of course, the hope is for liberation, but who are you when you stay within a system and situation of suffering? And then to see that Hagar wasn't just this passive side tertiary character, but that she actually had this amazing and robust life with God. And when she again was out in the desert, she was met by God and named God. Right? You're the God who sees me. That Hagar theologizes her own lived experience based on her autobiography, based on her life with God, exegeting what is happening to her body, to her child, her circumstances, what she is experiencing in a moment of desperation. She theologizes about who God is and names God. And God makes promises to her and to her descendants in the same way that he makes promises to Abraham and his descendants. And so then Black women saw that Hagar is not some tertiary peripheral character, but someone who has her own life with God and her own promises from God, and who, even though she is sent back into a position of oppression for a season, God makes a plan for her and her descendants to eventually be free. So that is like the beginning of womanist theology. And from there, womanist theology has grown and expanded and evolved, but essentially flows from a place that centers the lived experience of Black women. And you see there how theology isn't about abstract ideas. It's about answering the questions of your current reality. And you can hear how different the theology is from somebody who sees themselves in Hagar versus the way somebody who is outside of her story. So I looked up a sermon by this white guy, Robert LaRoe, and he says, Bible scholars are mixed in their take on Hagar. Some view her as an evil, vindictive temptress, but most see her as an innocent victim. But see how those categories are very male? That's how men categorize women. Evil, vindictive temptress, innocent victim. Hagar was a slave, Sarah's property, acquired by Abram during his unauthorized trip to Egypt. She was treated as a non-person. Sarah not even once called her by her name. Nobody asked Hagar how she felt about this arrangement. Sarah nearly ended up in Pharaoh's bed. Now the tables are turned, and Abram ends up in bed with an Egyptian. Only a man would talk about the story of Hagar this way. Hagar had entirely no choice in the matter. Thus was her lowly lot in life. But now she saw an opportunity to raise her status as a kind of second-class wife and the mother of Abram's promised son. Now listen to Dolores Williams. She says, was Hagar's naming of God an act of defiance and resistance, as well as an expression of awe? Do you hear how Hagar, in the hands of Dolores Williams, becomes a fully formed person? And that is, I think, the invitation for us. Liberating theology is about honoring the tensions and the complexity of our own specific story, and then looking in Scripture and finding our story there. I'll just close with something I'm thinking about personally in this area. As a Korean American, I feel deeply shaped by patriarchy in the Korean church. It's unaddressed. I've almost never, it's unaddressed. So I got this book recently called The Struggle to Be the Sun. And it's an Asian woman's liberation theology. And I opened it up, and inside is just an explanation of where the title comes from. And the title comes from a poem by a Japanese feminist from the early 1900s in Japan. And she basically wrote a poem that said, in the beginning, women were the sun. But through patriarchy and other systems, we became the moon. And the story of Asian women's liberation is the struggle to become the sun again. And I just closed the book and was like, that is a whole and complete thought. That the theology is important because it honors our story and it tells us something about ourselves. I didn't even need to read a single page of that book to feel seen and understood that was the title of the book. Because patriarchy is such a painful aspect of my experience in Korean Christian spaces. But that image of struggling to become the sun again, like poured honey over my soul, that is the direction I'm moving. So I'm going to close there. It is my hope that we will all engage scripture, not as something that we need to avoid because it's been weaponized against us, but following in the footsteps of mujerista theologians like Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, womanist theologians like Katie Cannon and Renita Weems, that we will honor the fullness of who we are.